Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
A senior US government official is quoted today by CNN saying that they are 99.9% certain that the 224 passengers aboard the Russian jet which crashed into the Sinai Desert last Saturday were the victims of an Islamist terrorist attack. That's a view in London as well as Washington, and now it would seem Moscow too. But its geopolitical significance will be massive if it represents the emergence of Islamic State, much better funded and organized than Al-Qaeda, as a terrorist group capable of hitting targets far from its Syrian and Iraqi heartlands. We're joined by our correspondent Steve Rosenberg. Steve, is there any indication yet of how, assuming that it is shown to be a terrorist attack, any indication of how Mr. Putin is going to respond?
No, not yet. I think it's important to remember that despite the growing suspicion that this was a bomb, the official Kremlin line still is that it's keeping an open mind about this disaster. It's treating all theories equally, and the Kremlin says the fact that it suspended all flights to Egypt does not mean that it favours the terror theory over any other. Having said that, if it is proven to have been a bomb, then judging by the way President Putin has responded in the past to terror attacks, I think we can expect a forceful response from him.
How is the domestic politics? I know it's hard to tell this because the media is so controlled by the Kremlin, but is this an opportunity for Mr. Putin to further strengthen his position with a tougher crackdown? Or is there a fear in the Kremlin that having casualties as a result of his war on terror isn't going to make him very popular?
It's an interesting question. I remember back in 2004 when there was a string of terror attacks on Russian soil. There were bombs in the Moscow metro, 2 planes bombed out of the sky, and the year ended with the Beslan school siege, in which more than 330 people were killed. All of that, or none of that, seemed to dent Vladimir Putin's popularity, and quite the opposite. He used that to strengthen the power of the Kremlin. Now, you could argue that if this does prove to have been a bomb, that could undermine the narrative that the Kremlin has been pushing domestically about its military operation in Syria. In other words, Russia has been saying that it's been carrying out airstrikes in Syria to boost Russian national security, destroying terrorists there so they couldn't come to Russia and kill people there. Now, that narrative would be seriously undermined. But whether Russians would connect the dots and say, well, President Putin said we'll be safer, but we're clearly not, I don't think that would happen. And that is because the Kremlin controls so tightly the media here, and particularly television. And television is the key to influencing public opinion. So if the Kremlin was to change the narrative to something more like, we have been attacked, we are the victims of terror, we need to carry on our battle against international terrorism, I think the Russian public would support that. And certainly from the people I've spoken to on the streets of St. Petersburg this morning, I haven't heard a word of criticism of Vladimir Putin. Most people have said to me, we understand that Russia is at threat of terror attacks, and they don't seem to connect what may have happened to the Russian Airbus with Russia's military operation in Syria.
Steve Rosenberg in St. Petersburg, thanks for that. We're joined now back in London by the Foreign Affairs analyst Tim Marshall, by Dr. Domitila Sagramoso, an expert in Russian security from King's College London, and joining us from our Plymouth studio, Conservative MP John Mercer. He sits on the Commons Defence Committee. He's a former British Army officer. Tim Marshall, let me come to you first. If, as the intelligence suggests, this attack was coordinated with Islamic State leaders in Raqqa and its affiliate in the Sinai, called Sinai Province, it means that Islamic State has the capability to plot mass casualty attacks outside of Syria and Iraq.
Well, I think the future will be they will be able to do it globally. And this is the first sign of doing it outside of the 2 countries that they mostly operate in. Bortnikov is the head of the FSB, the Russian intelligence service. He met Putin on Friday. Putin came straight out and said, ground the planes. I think that tells us what the Russians really believe. It's difficult for the Russians. It's 2.5 million Russians go there on holiday, only 1 million Brits. Britain is third. It's Russia, Germany, Britain, and then France in the amount of tourists. As an added complication, Sisi, the president, has been to Moscow 3 times since he was elected. What Russia is doing is trying to pull Egypt away from America. You remember back in the 60s, 70s, it flipped from Russia to America. He's trying to pull it back. So it's difficult for the Egyptians and Russians to come out too openly and say. So to go back to your original point, Andrew, I think it's pretty clear that the ISIS affiliate in Sinai swore allegiance to ISIS in Raqqa. They're under a lot of pressure from the Russians. About 20% of the bombing was against ISIS in Syria. They've said, right, we need revenge blowback. They've told their affiliate in the Sinai, you're the ones who can do it, you do the operation. They've killed the Russians. Now the Russians have to respond. I agree with what the Moscow correspondent said. Putin does not respond. Putin responds. And I have never seen the Russians react with anything other than more violence when confronted with violence.
Johnny Meltzer, if what we're saying is true, if this has been a planned attack prompted by Islamic State, it takes IS into what is called full spectrum terrorist activity. And it's better financed than Al-Qaeda. It is better resourced and organized in Syria and Iraq than Osama bin Laden ever was sitting in a cave in Afghanistan. This takes the global war on terrorism to a whole new level, does it not?
Good afternoon, Andrew. I think that this threat is existential. You can see if this is proved to be something that has originated from so-called Islamic State, you can see their strategic reach, and this is exactly why the Prime Minister has been going on about this vote on Syria for so long. We have to do something about so-called Islamic State because the threat is only going to get closer. You know, we see this great outpouring of humanity when you see that little boy washed up on the beach, and you see, you know, we've had 30 of our own terrorists massacred in Tunisia. This is only going to get closest.
I understand that, but therefore, is the British response, which of course the Prime Minister hasn't managed to get Parliament to agree to, of deploying 8 Tornado jets into Syria, is that really adequate given what you've just called an existential threat?
Look, we need to do what we're asked to do by the coalition. So it's not a question of how much sort of manpower or machinery we're sending. It's about the effect we can achieve on the ground. And what we've been asked to do is provide those tornadoes because they have a specific tactical and technical capability that the coalition are after when it comes to dynamic targeting within Syria. Now, we should stand up to that and we should do our duty and we should have the stomach for the fight. Okay. The idea that we're asking people just to go over and do some mass bombing in Syria with no sort of strategy is completely misinformed. And I think that, you know, we should have really got past this by now.
Okay. Dr. Sagra Mirza, what does this mean for Russia and for Mr. Putin?
Well, to a certain extent, I think that this has brought the war back to Russia. And I would disagree with what the correspondent was saying, that the Russians are not going to be particularly affected and critical of Putin's behavior in the Middle East. I think on the one hand, they understood, or that's their argument, that the Assad regime needed to be reinforced because they are convinced that if the Assad regime had fallen, then there was a very high chance that you would have had either the Islamic State or Al-Nusra or other jihadist groups in Damascus and in the western parts of the country. So they understand that. But on the other hand, they're going to put a lot of brakes to any attempt by Putin, for example, to send ground troops, which I think he's not planning to do either. I think that probably his response is going to be maybe an intensification of some of the bombing in Raqqa and, you know, just to...
He hasn't done much of that so far, Tim Marshall. He's mainly been bombing the other groups that are against Assad. He may now extend the bombing to Islamic State.
I'm almost certain he will. In fact, if you look at the pattern of bombing, which was about 80% against the Free Syrian Army, it changed on Thursday. There was an increase in bombing on Raqqa and the ISIS targets, and I think you're going to see more of that in the coming days. There is no way that the Russians will not react to this. Also, I think the Russian public, if you look at 9/11 and the reaction of the American public, if you look at lots of things that have happened to lots of countries, the immediate reaction in the first few weeks and months is not, oh, our foreign policy is wrong. The immediate reaction is revenge. It's the most potent of many of the human emotions. And I'm absolutely certain that in the short term, the Russian public will support more action. And back to your original point, ISIS is now in Libya, Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, India. It's trying to get a foothold in the Muslim population in India. It's growing very slowly in many other countries, and it has become, and this is the real point, the poster boy for jihadists. It's replaced Al-Qaeda, and with that comes money and people prepared to kill themselves.
Mr. Mercer, the head of MI5 says the threat from terrorism to the UK is the highest he's ever seen. And that was before the jet went down over the Sinai desert. We now know, we've had it independently corroborated, that IS has been using mustard gas on civilians in Aleppo. Almost not because it's of any use to them really, but almost as a sign, we've got it. Like a sign to the West, we've got this. Is our response seriously adequate to all this?
I think traditionally up until now, I don't think we have been militarily as involved as we should have done. I think that, we're in a difficult place in this country. We are sort of learning or still healing from the mistakes of the last 10, 15 years in terms of foreign policy engagement. But I think, that can't then mean that we sort of draw up the drawbridge and think that the way to keep safe at home and to keep our way of life is to have no strategic involvement overseas. I think, if it is proved that this is done by so-called Islamic State, I think it just demonstrates their strategic reach, and it just reinforces that argument that we have to do something about this threat, because it is only going to come closer, and it's not good enough for it to come closer and closer and for something to happen and then afterwards for us to say, right, well, we should have done this and we should have done that. We need to come up with an intelligent foreign policy sort of surgical intervention strategy. This is what the Prime Minister is trying to do, and we should absolutely support him in that.
Mr. Mercer refers to how Afghanistan and Iraq hang over this country's foreign policy and military responses now. Does Afghanistan, from the Soviet era, does that hang over? Is that a restraint on what the Kremlin might do today?
Totally. I mean, they're very much aware of the risks that occurred when they intervened, and the deaths and the casualties when they intervened in Afghanistan. It was one of the reasons why the Soviet Union became so weak and eventually then led to its disintegration.
Demise, yeah.
So there is only one other point that I would like to make, which I think hasn't been really looked carefully, and people in Russia are now talking about this, experts I'm saying, is the fact that to a certain extent, this attack was also very much targeted against Egypt. And I think that a lot of the focus has been on Russia. And for me, it was always not very clear why ISIS in Egypt in the Sinai was going to attack a Russian plane, and why not the people who are actually under the bombs. And it seems very much that we shouldn't forget the dimension that to a certain extent the Russians might have not been the initial main objective of this attack, but to really have an impact on Egypt and on the Egyptian tourism industry, because the country that is suffering the most from this attack is actually going to be Egypt.
It's going to be Egypt because
so
its
I think
economy is so weak.
We have to be a bit more careful when we analyze these groups and the connections, and not immediately assume that ISIS in Raqqa is giving this order. I disagree with that interpretation.
But Tim Marshall, here's the rub at the moment. We now face this potential far wider, more dangerous, better resourced terrorist threat than ever before. And it happens at a time when we say, oh, well, we all must get together to deal with this, but the British are not bombing in Syria. I was looking at the figures. America's Arab allies have stopped bombing as well. The Saudi Arabia, the UAE, it's diverted its jets to the battle in Yemen. Bahrain has not been part of anything since February. The Saudis since September. Jordan since August. America, which is pretty half-hearted in this anyway, is almost on its own in dealing with this now.
And with a president that is not keen on doing this, and he was pushed into it. The British situation is different because of the politics of the matter. I mean, it's clear at the moment the politics is not there in the House of Commons. The maths does not add up. The SNP, Labour and Tory rebels will vote it down, so you can't go. And because of, we were talking earlier, because of Iraq, we're not going to go without parliamentary approval. Last thing on the world spectrum, the one country that is pushed probably harder than any other in a Western sense is the French. The French are putting the Charles de Gaulle aircraft carrier back into the Gulf.
Yes, well-
it was there for 2 months, and they're sailing it back now for another operation.
At the request of the Americans,
Yes.
because they've had to remove the
They want-
Theodore Roosevelt.
they
For
want
the
help
first
and-
time
yeah.
since 2007, the Americans don't have a carrier in the Gulf.
And this is why the Americans want the Brits. It's not because of the firepower. I mean, the 8 tornadoes would make a difference, but they can do it without. It's political top cover to say, hang on, we as a culture who have commonalities in our belief systems, we are standing together. And at the moment, they're not.
We'll leave it there. I thank all three of you for being with us on the Sunday Politics.